so it could customize things to show you, right? So we were missing a bunch of key ingredients. But in a kind of a deeper way, I think that a couple of sort of core architectural themes had been set aside. And so now I'm talking about, like 1999, 2000, the internet boom. And there were some things that had been present really in the beginning that had gone missing and needed to be and are still being brought back. So one of them was this idea of peer-to-peer, right? The original internet was a peer-to-peer network. There weren't clients and servers. There were hosts. And hosts could, make calls and they could receive calls, right? And everything was bidirectional. And it was great, but that didn't survive the sort of mainstream commercialization of the web. So we got to a place where, clients were a distinct subspecies, and clients were underprivileged. They were behind NATs, network address translators, right? They weren't even really part of the internet. They were part of these little private network ghettos that were sort of connected to the internet indirectly, right? And the first-class citizens, the things that actually lived in the real internet, in what we now call the cloud, were a subset. They were these special servers, right? And you didn't have much access to those things. And you certainly didn't have much of a presence in that space. The other thing that was missing was this idea of the two-way web. So, I always just mention this because a lot of people either don't know or have forgotten, but the very first web browser wasn't just a browser. It wasn't just a thing that you read the internet with. It was a read-write surface. And, it was a writing tool as well as a reading tool. And the notion, Tim Berners-Lee's notion of what the web was a place where people could collaborate on documents. They were producers and consumers, right? But when we went to the mainstream commercial web, it sort of devolved to something more like television, more like broadcast mass media. And we lost that, So that's what became so exciting to me moving into the era of blogging, was that, it wasn't that the read-write web was a new thing. It was that we were sort of reclaiming what the original intention and legacy of the web was and should have been. And for me, this what we now sort of take for granted in terms of active participation, everything that's happening in social networks. In the early blog era, and I was there, and Phil was there, and Steve Gilmore were there, and, those of us who were active bloggers in, like 2001, 2002, were having this experience where we realized that we were contextualizing the web for one another, right? So, the way I started to think about it was, as I publish into this medium and as I read around in this medium, what I'm doing is, I'm using other people as my amplifiers and my filters, right? So somebody over here that knows more than I do about a certain area and is able to follow an area more closely than I can. Well, I see that through that person's lens, and they add a tremendous amount of value because I learn to trust them. And I find out the important stuff. I don't have to pay attention to a lot of other stuff. And I'm doing that for them as well in the areas where I'm confident, right? So, this for me was all of the best of what we're trying to get to with the current generation of social networking and in a way, none of the noise and clutter. But, things do change. But this notion of context as a service that we provide to one another was really the key thing. And there was a moment where this kind of crystallized for me. It's something that Dave Weiner talked about. I can't remember when, but what happened is that one day something interesting happened in the .NET space, and Dave noted it on his blog. But the thing was that Dave didn't really know too much about the .NET world, right? He only knew that there was this blogger and that blogger, then the other blogger, who he trusted as authorities in that space. And every once in a while, one of them would blog something, and he would say, "Oh, that seems like it might be interesting." And another day, another one of them would pop up and say something. He would sort of take note of it. And then one day, all three of these guys fired at the same time, basically. And he went, "Aha, that means by definition, something interesting and important happened in the .NET space today, right? Like, I just know that a priori because the network told me. And when I reflect on that now and when I talk about that now, I use the terminology that I use is summation, and the term comes from biology, right? And it's what happens in a nervous system where you have 3 neurons impinging on a fourth, right? And the signal isn't going to propagate unless all 3 of the inputs fire. 1 or 2 won't do it, right? So what I actually assert is that this human network that we're creating of contextual filters for one another is, in some sense, it's literally a nervous system, right? It's a nervous system writ large, and so PubSub for me is hugely important. There's a term that came up, I guess, in the context of Twitter recently. Somebody started talking about what a breakthrough it was to have this thing called asymmetric follow. Have people heard that term? So the idea is, I can follow you on Twitter, but you don't necessarily have to follow me, or vice versa, right? And it's been hailed as a great Twitter innovation. But actually, I think that's wrong, right? I think that asymmetric follow is just another name for PubSub, right? And I think that this idea of PubSub is something that we actually had, from the get-go in blogging, and it's possible in any kind of PubSub medium. PubSub medium, not specifically Twitter, but it's kind of fundamental to this ability for us to have to construct for ourselves arrangements of filters which are in fact other people, right? And this is what I think we're actually trying to get to in social networks. In a way, I think of myself as a context consumer, right? And as the people who are providing these services to me as context providers. The quality of the contextualization that I get is partly a function of course, who do I include? But it also depends on what are those people doing, right? Like, how reliable are my people in my network? People are better and worse at it, but in general, I guess what I'm saying is that there are tools and technologies that we can just take off the shelf and interpose between us and the world that will learn about us and do a lot of useful filtering for us. But we also need to be aware that many of the most useful filters are other people, and we also need to think about the ways in which we are or are not being useful filters for other people, right? So our participation in these networks, it's a two-way street, right? We have to be aware of the value that we're getting from other people, but we also have to be aware of the value that we're delivering or not delivering when we're plugged into these networks. So okay, so RSS was, I don't know, Steve and I had, I don't know how many conversations about RSS. For us, the thing about it was that, we were putting side by side the stuff that qualified individuals had who we decided were qualified, right? And then we put it right next to the stuff that the conventional media said were qualified and authoritative, right? And we could just, put those things into the same list, and we could choose, and we could use those things in connection with one another. And so, we wound up with this network of amplifiers and filters that was incredibly effective for a while. But, you probably noticed that it's not the case now that most people get up in the morning and fire up their RSS reader and plug into this network of sources and figure out, what's the interesting and important stuff that's going on. Right? That sort of hasn't happened. What hundreds of millions of people do though is plug into Facebook, right? And so I've thought a lot about that. And I think that the issue is that what Facebook is doing, part of what Facebook is doing for people right now is making it much easier to be an active participant in this network, right? Blogging, to get the feedback, to get the sense of engagement, you had to work harder as a context producer and as a context consumer. Facebook makes it kind of easy, and that's a good thing. But, people, I think, have yet to really understand the degree to which they're trading away ownership and control of their context. both in terms of what their ability, of what they're able to receive and what they're able to project, right? So we had, many more degrees of freedom in the early blogosphere,